Hello and welcome to another edition of Mailbag. What is Mailbag? Well, Mailbag is a feature of the channel where you guys leave lots of comments on the channel and I attempt to answer those comments, or if I can't answer those comments, I throw it out to you guys who have more knowledge on some of this stuff than I do. So let's get into the first mailbag of this session. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. Next comment or question comes from the Death Beats, and this was in response to Roland JX-3P Part 2 Getting Inside, a video I did in, although I've got it written down as April 2022, it was April 2023. What Gary has said is, Gary being the pseudonym for the Death Beats, is there a way of telling what version of firmware is installed on the JX3P? Also, how does it work with firmware for old synths? Are there updates made by Roland or third parties? And if so, what happens is multiple third parties making different updates? Cheers. Ooh, and it's a really good question because I've got to be honest and say, inside this JX3P, there is a chip. And normally on a Roland synthesizer, what they have on top of the chips is they have a sequence of numbers or characters. And what they do is they use like a red dotted pen and they dot the relevant numbers to tell you what firmware version you're on. And the way you would normally check it is you read off from top to bottom what the numbers are and write them down, and that tells you your firmware. That's normally how this stuff works on these older Roland synths. Other synth manufacturers may have different ways of doing it. But with this particular synth, the JX3P I've had on the bench, the problem is there is a ROM chip in there. It looks like an EEPROM chip has been upgraded at some point. But there is no reference on the chip to tell me what version of firmware is. And I have to be honest and say, I haven't gone searching on the internet to find out how do you tell from the interface. If you can tell from the interface, should I say. Sorry. So that's a really interesting question. Now, if we go and look at a modern synth, you know, with a modern synth, you download a file to your laptop, you plug the device into your laptop, you follow a process that may require you to run an app, it may require you to dump a file to a location on the laptop, on the device that is now showing up as a drive on your laptop. And then you follow the instructions and effectively you flash the ROM chip that's in the device with the new code that you've just loaded onto it. Now, as I say, back in the old days though, what you did was you took the chip out and you put a new chip in. And that's how a manufacturer effectively supplied updates for bug fixes. It was much more harsh, but then I think synthesizers back in the old days were much more thoroughly tested before they were stuck into the market, because the cost of issuing chips to people or having to open synthesizers up post-production and put chips into them because you discovered a major bug is very, very costly compared with where we are at the moment, which is send a message out to all the people who have registered for support and put messages out on social media saying new version of operating system, new version of firmware is available, go here to download it. And you effectively are getting your customer to do the hard work rather than you or your service tech to do the hard work. So that's how it used to work in the old days. And if you didn't have a chip that was socketed, then you'd probably ask your service technician to put a socket in, because you knew very well you might have to update the firmware version again when they found the next bug. but that was kind of how it worked. And as I said, this was the case in Roland, where they would supply you with the chip. On the chip would be written the firmware version. In fact, if you go onto the internet and you look at firmware versions for many old legacy, quite often the person supplying the firmware, and all it is effectively an EEPROM, and they have bought a series of EEPROMs that are compatible with your synthesizer, and they have burnt the operating system on it from a file that they've probably liberated from the internet. So in order to answer the second part of the question, which is, how do you do it? Effectively, you are burning a new version of the firmware. Now, you can only have one version of the firmware operating on the synthesizer at any point in time. Now, with the newer machines, in some of the newer machines, you can't go backwards. So you are limited to what the manufacturer pushes out, and if they push out a version that is buggy, then actually trying to go backwards is really difficult. Whereas with the old style of implementation, so plug in a ROM chip into a circuit board, if it doesn't work very well, what you do is you take the ROM chip out and you put the old ROM chip back in until the manufacturer releases the next version that hopefully fixes all the problems that you found with the version that you just installed. I'm hoping that all makes absolute sense, because sometimes I read this stuff back to myself and think, what the hell were you writing, John? Now, there were various third parties that made upgrades to the firmwares for various machines, and I'm probably at this point thinking about Vercomen, who did the upgrades for the JX-8P and the JX-10, only because I was discussing that the other day, and that's probably the reason why I've written in here. And another good example is the exclamation mark stuff that was done for the DS7. Now, needless to say, if you installed one of these upgrades into your precious synth, you voided the warranty. Now, given how much time has passed since between A and B, if you did it now, do you care about the warranty? No. But there is a word of caution here. And the word of caution around this sort of stuff is be very careful, because quite often, in order to install some of these upgrades, firmware version upgrades, not only are you having to change the ROM chip, but you're also having to quite often maybe disable a pin on a chip, on an IC chip, or solder a wire to a pin leg, or do some other stuff, or install a daughter board. So it's not always as simple as just updating the firmware like Roland would have done in the past. To add these additional functions, quite often you are actually having to add additional hardware into the synthesizer itself. So again, if you're not comfortable doing this sort of stuff, you know what? Don't do it, get someone else to do it, or kind of stick to your lot, if that makes any sense. Now, there is a really good video, and if I remember to put the link to it down below, which was made by Syntaur, where they took a Juno-106 and made it into a Juno-107, and that actually includes a custom firmware chip which they wrote. So they wrote specific pieces into the firmware for the mods that they made to the 106 to make it the Syntaur Juno-107. So if I remember, I will put it down below.